The Bronco has been on stock suspension long enough. It's time to upgrade. I have a 2-inch Dobinson IMS lift kit ready to put on the Bronco, and in this video we're going to go over the entire installation process. While the Bronco looks good in stock form, it's even better with a lift and 37s on it.
What you see behind me is a very dirty Bronco on a Dobinson IMS 2-inch lift kit with 37-inch tires. And in this video, I'm gonna walk you through the entire installation process. Before we get into that, however, there's a couple things I need to mention. The first thing I wanna cover is the kit itself and kind of what's happening with that. The second thing I wanna cover is things that I found throughout the installation process that you should check out before you begin the installation. So if you're not interested in this first section, I'll timestamp what you need to see down here so you can get straight to the installation side of things. So why Dobinsons for the Bronco? I had Dobinsons MRRs on my Toyota Tacoma and I absolutely love them. They were a phenomenal kit. So when I was at Overland Expo PNW in 2023, Dobinsons was there and I was talking to them, asking them if they had an MRA kit coming for the Bronco. And they said yes, it was in development. So we got to chatting a little bit and they've never had anyone run an IMS and the MRR or MRAs back to back on the same platform. So I am lucky enough to be able to run both suspensions back to back and give you a review and kind of my thoughts of the two different suspension kits and what might work better for you. So right now the IMS kit is on there. In a couple weeks, the MRRs are going on there, and that's what will likely stay on the Bronco. Now for the installation itself, before you even begin the installation, look at all of the mounting points, specifically the lower control arms in the front and then the lower shock mount on the rear axle. Both of those are prone to bending and getting a lot of rock damage, and both of which I had issues with on this install, which really slowed the installation down. The front lower control arm was one thing. I was able to bend that back in place, not the control arm itself, but the mount. The lower shock mount on the rear axle was not that easy. That had to be cut out and new one welded in. So look at that stuff before you begin the installation to make sure that you're not gonna run into those issues throughout your install, or so you can prepare for them. Second thing I want to say is the IMS kit is a complete kit minus the top hats. So you need to reuse the OEM top hats from Ford and put them on the Dobinson shock and coil. With that, they give you specifications for setting that up. So the spring seat height is, they say 9.55 inches in the front and then 7.66 inches in the rear. What I found setting that spring seat at 9.55 inches in the front was way too much lift. It gave me 5 inches of lift. So I had to do a couple iterations of taking the strut out, resetting the spring seat, and finding that right balance. And to be honest, it is probably a little too low for my liking. So I ended up setting the spring seat at 7.25 inches, which gave me 1.5 inches lift. So I think if you were to set it at 7.5 to maybe 7.75, that would give you the 2 to 2.5 inch lift that you're looking for with this kit. So those are the two real things that you need to think about before starting on this install. And with that, let's get into it. The first thing we need to do is take some before measurements. And we're gonna measure it from the middle of the axle to the bottom of the fender flare.
So the stock Bronco with a Sasquatch package measures 21 inches in the front, again from the center of the hub to the bottom of the fender flare, and 22 inches in the back.
Before we can get this on the Bronco, we need to set up the springs for the correct height. So what we're measuring is from the center of this bushing right here to this portion of the spring seat. So for the front springs, it needs to be 9.54 inches or 243 millimeters. For the rear, it needs to be 7.66 inches or 195 millimeters. So that's step one, and then we'll start ripping apart the Bronco. just to tease these real quick. These are the MRAs with your remote reservoir and your compression adjustability. Oh man, I cannot wait to get these on. But these are also quite expensive, so I'm very interested to try the MRS and kind of see how they stack up. I've heard good things, so let's continue with this.
So part of the kit is a diff drop kit and a sway bar relocation kit. In order to swap those out, the skid plates will have to be removed.
First thing I'm going to do is install the diff drop kit, which sits right here. There are two 18mm bolts holding it to the frame, and then there's one 21mm bolt. This is the 21mm bolt that I was talking about, and then this is the diff mount right there. So we're swapping this piece. And that feeds through the diff. And then we can pop that out, and we'll put the new diff mount in. There's actually one more 21mm bolt that sits right there. So what you have to do is loosen or take the bolts out for the transmission cooler, and you can just pivot that up and get a socket in there to get that loose.
For me, everything on the diff drop kit lined up perfectly. The only thing I'll say is leave the two bottom 18mm bolts loose while you get both of the 21mm bolts in place.
So in order to get the strut out, we have to remove the lower control arm. So I'm gonna mark the cam bolts right there, and then I'll remove that, and then we can remove the strut. The cam bolts are out. We got to remove these. Well, the cam bolts aren't out, but now they're loosened. We need to remove these to give the lower control arm a little bit more play, and then we can get those cam bolts out.
You can see here that the upper control arm isn't connected to the steering knuckle, and that's because before I realized I needed to take the lower control arm out, I was going to try to move the knuckle enough by removing the upper control arm. That didn't work, so don't even bother. Go straight to the lower control arm.
Doing everything I could to avoid doing this, but Ford didn't make it easy. So I had to go get some spring compressors to get the springs off the old struts, and then I need to compress the new springs to put the top hat from the OEM top hat onto the Dobinson springs. So really not a fan of spring compressors. I don't like them at all, but this is my only option, so that's what we got to do. That is what we need to reuse. So when I was taking the strut off, I wanted to make sure that I had enough threads on the back side, so when the spring decompressed, I would be able to get this off without it losing threads and shooting off. Now that I'm trying to compress springs, I want as much thread as possible. So thinking, yeah, So this is my move right here. So I'll get these on real quick. I compressed the spring as much as I was comfortable with, and it wasn't enough. We needed more. So I took it to a shop and had them compress it. Shops have much better spring compressors. Some are even hydraulic. So they were able to put these springs on in literally 5 minutes. So that's what I ended up doing. If you end up doing the same thing, well, regardless, even if you do this yourself, make sure the orientation of the top hat is where you need it, in line with the bottom portion of the strut. So for the Bronco, this pin right here will sit in the back of the strut tower. So time to get this bad boy in and wrap up the front end of this lift kit.
You may have to remove the tie rod from the steering knuckle in order to get the shock in and out. I didn't have to do this on the driver's side, but I did on the passenger side. So if you're having clearance issues getting the shock in or out, take that tie rod off and you'll have plenty of space.
So the strut's in. Now all we got to do is prop the lower control arm into place, put those cam bolts on, make sure they're lined up with the markings that we made prior to taking them off, which should be pretty simple. I've already done the passenger side and it's cake. I wrapped the whole thing up in like 30 minutes. This side's going to be a little bit different. I have hit something, a rock presumably, on the lower control arm mount, and it's bent in. This isn't necessarily part of the install. Hopefully you don't have this issue when you go to do it.
Before you put the lower control arm back into place, hand tighten the two 18mm nuts that go on the bottom of the strut. I tried a couple different things to bend the lower control arm mount back into place. What I ended up landing on was the biggest crescent wrench I have wrapped around it, and that gave me enough leverage to actually bend it to the point where I could get the lower control arm back into place.
Looks a little funky now because the back is at stock height still, but the front is done. Very, very excited to see what this is going to look like at its final kind of resting height. But that's a big lift, and those 37s look real good in that wheel well. So I don't want to waste any time. Let's get going on the back. So it has been a couple days since I've worked on the Bronco, and you're about to see why. But during this break, I have been trying to plan my next trip. So Onyx has this new feature, relatively new, that color codes the difficulty of a trail system. So they have green, blue, black, and red. So me getting a lift, 37s, and now have a winch, I'm looking for some black trails. You can see here how the color coding works. So you have a lot of green trails and then a little blue trails mixed in there. And it's a really nice feature to have, to know kind of what you're getting into. These are rated by people who have actually driven them. So if you go in and click on the trail, you can actually see, photos of the trail and current conditions and stuff like that. If you're not using Onyx, you should definitely give it a try. My code OTG20 will get you 20% off an elite membership, and I think it's well worth it. So let's get back to this install because I really want to get this thing on the trail. So we have to get to the 3 bolts on top of this that are holding the strut up into place. They say you can kind of peel this back and get to it. That sounds like a pain, so I'm just gonna take this liner completely out and give myself more working room. So in order to get to some of these, we actually have to bend this out of the way just a little bit. So I'm gonna take a mallet and just so there's 3 bolts, just like the front, and then a pin. The pin this time is facing the front of the vehicle instead of the inside of the vehicle. So I'm gonna get those off. There's really no good place for me to put the camera so you could see that, but there are 3 15mm bolts. The bolts on top are loose, so we'll take the bottom of the strut, disconnect that. So there's a 27 on one side, on the bolt side, and then a 30mm on the nut side. Yes. That came out a whole lot easier than the front. I'm gonna do the other side of the Bronco. I'm gonna do that off camera. But then we need to compress these springs and get this top hat off again and put it on the Dobinsons rear shocks. Okay, so for orientation of the top hat for the back of the Bronco, this pin right here faces the front of the vehicle. So, which means these 2 bolts want to be lined up with, like, straight in line with where the bolt's going to go through at the bottom. That is essentially where that needs to be, right there.
To ensure I have the orientation of the top hat correct, I put them into the Bronco, just kind of loosely hand tightened everything and made small adjustments to make sure everything lined up.
All right, so I got one of the rears all done. Again, the spring seat height is set at 7.66 inches from the center of this bolt hole right there to the lowest part of the spring seat. With this one done, I'm gonna go ahead and do the other side, and then we'll start putting all this back together. Yeah, we gotta remove the pan hard bar and get the adjustment right on that, and then we'll throw these back in the vehicle. So next thing you'll see is pan hard bar removal. Okay, so now we gotta remove this pan hard bar. I've already released the other side. So we just gotta do the portion that's mounted to the frame. And it's a 24mm bolt. Old pan hard bar, new pan hard bar. This thing is quite a bit more beefy. It is chunky. But what I'm gonna do now is measure from like the center of the bolt holes and get this to the same length as the stock one. I think this will have to be extended a little bit longer. The whole point of a pan hard bar is to keep the axle centered in the frame. Right, so this is going to be something that I might have to adjust multiple times once I have the vehicle on the ground to make sure the axle is centered in the frame. But for now, I'm going to set this to the stock length just to get a starting point, and I'll adjust it further if needed. This looks like the stock one, 44¼ Dobinsons bar. Sits at 44, almost dead, so we need to extend it a little bit. 4 1/8. Yep, there we go, that's where I need it to be.
Once you get the pan hard bar mounted back to the frame, rest the other side in the mount on the axle and then jack the axle up to about ride height. The pan hard bar will not line up with the axle mount at full droop.
It's been a couple days since I've worked on the Bronco. The lower shock mounts on the rear axle are destroyed. Well, the driver's side is destroyed. Passenger side's okay. But it's preventing me from getting the rest of the lift kit in because the bolt holes don't line up like at all. They're twisted. So someone's coming over right now. I found someone local who can come in here, cut these old brackets off, and then I have a new set of brackets arriving tomorrow, and they're a little bit thicker and they're boxed in, and then I have armor coming as well because I'm not going to repeat this again. So once we get this done, we can get back on track with the install. Hopefully you don't have this issue with yours, but I think the learning thing here, the teaching moment, is definitely check the vehicle before you get started. Make sure that everything's going to go back together the way it comes apart, because that was not the case for me. But yeah, anyways, we'll get this done and then we'll get the suspension in the back.
Time to get the rear strut back in place. So feed the top hat through the top of the strut mount, loosely put some of the 15mm bolts onto the 3 bolts. To get the bottom bolt hole to line up, you may need to jack up the axle just a little bit in order to get that bolt to feed through. Another thing to keep in mind is there's 2 spacers that's going to go on either side of the strut bushing in the lower shock mount. With the lower shock bolt in place, lift the rear axle up so the top hat is level in the strut tower, and then tighten those 15mm bolts down. Be sure to torque everything once it's fully weighted. All torque specs will be listed in the description.
So you might be able to see the front is about 3 inches too high. You can see the back there. It's at quite a bit of a Carolina squat, which is not the goal. So, so I got to rip the front apart and lower that spring seat a little bit, and hopefully that will take care of this. It might have to happen a couple times because I'm not sure how much I need to back that off, but yeah, that's where I'm at now. So I compressed it about 1 inch. I don't think that'll give me a 3-inch drop like I need, but I want to check it and then we'll go from there. All right, so I dropped that about 1 inch and it dropped about 1.25 inches. So clearly it's not a 1-for-1 measurement there. I think I'm gonna bring it down another 1.25 inches to maybe 1.5 inches And then it should be at the correct ride height. So I'm gonna get this side dialed in before I move on to the passenger side, understanding fully that because the fronts are not level, it might skew the measurements that I take. So I'm trying to take that into account as I'm searching for the correct setting. So Dobinsons recommends a 9.54 inch gap between the where the spring is going to sit and the center of the bolt hole. I'm looking at between a 7 and a 7.5 to get the ride height that I want. The 9.5 gave me like 5 inches of lift in the front, and that's too much. That's not what I want. The back is dialed. The back is perfect. So that's 195 millimeters or 7.66 inches. It's perfect. I've already measured it. It's 2 inches of ride height or of lift. Perfect. So now I'm just trying to dial in the front. So I'm gonna do this off camera real quick, and next time you see me, we should be good to go.
As soon as I got the kit on and the vehicle aligned, I took it straight out to Tahuya with a group of Broncos to test the lift out.
So my initial impressions of the IMS kit. I want to cover a couple things. I want to talk about the installation itself, and then I want to talk about what I've experienced in ride quality so far. So again, these are initial impressions. These are not long-term impressions. First of all, the installation. The installation was not that easy. There are, Dobinsons doesn't actually have instructions for the installation of this kit. So it was, I don't want to say trial and error, but there was some figuring out that needed to happen. So hopefully this video will help you a lot if you choose to do this installation. If you're looking for something on paper, I'll have an article written on trailbronco.com. That'll be a couple weeks, probably after this video goes live, but an installation guide will be on there as well. Like I said, I had issues with the spring seat height. The back was perfectly fine at 7.66 inches, which is what Dobinsons suggests. The front I had issues with. It was way too much lift, and now there's not enough lift. So trying to fine tune the front end has been difficult. So between those two things, hopefully I've alleviated the first issue with not having installation instructions with this video and then the article on Trail Bronco. And then I think you'll have a better starting point with the front spring seat if you start at like 7.5 inches, maybe 7.75 instead of the 9.5 that they suggest. So initial driving impressions. So around town, it's actually far more supple than I thought it was gonna be. I have kind of the heavy duty springs in front and rear, so the front should take an extra 110 pounds and the rear will take 220 pounds. Even unloaded, the rear doesn't feel stiff. I really thought it was gonna be a jarring ride, but it's not soft at all, but it's very comfortable. It gives you a little bit of float. Like it's way better over speed bumps. I can mob over speed bumps with this kit, and the suspension takes it really, really well, far better than the Haas 2.0 suspension that I had on this from the factory. So really impressed with it around town. There's probably a little bit more body lean with it now. So like I said, it's a little bit softer, but as soon as you get past that kind of initial stroke, it stiffens up quite a bit and it feels very supportive. And I'll say the same thing for off-road. It performed amazingly off-road. I had no issues with it whatsoever. It allowed a great amount of articulation. I don't think I lost any articulation. I don't know if I necessarily gained any either. But the real difference there is I had 35s, now I have 37s. So a lot's changed with this. It's not just, you know, the suspension that are affecting these things. On the subject of the 37s, they do rub at 1.5 inches of lift in the front. I think some high clearance wheel wells would take care of that, but right now they rub quite a bit.
Difficulty of the installation aside, I am very impressed with this kit. It performs far better than I thought it was going to for the kit that it is. It's extremely comfortable, not jarring like I anticipated. it offers a great ride and great performance off-road as well. I did find myself wanting the adjustability of the MRRs on the road and off-road. I felt like if I could stiffen up the compression a little bit on the road, it would have been better. And then off-road, dial that back a little bit so it floats a little better. That said, I think this is tuned really, really well for the Bronco and all conditions you may face. And with a starting price of $1,840, it's pretty good value for money as well. So stay tuned for the MRRs going in soon. And until then, I hope you're able to get off the grid and off the grind, and I'll see you in the next one.